Civilians moved quickly through the streets, flanked by Golden Bough guards, forming a protective barrier around them. The tension in the air was palpable, every footstep underscored by the clicking of verdant stalkers' hooked legs as they prowled closer. The guards kept their weapons ready, emboldened by the presence of their families among the fleeing crowd, yet the stalkers' amber eyes glowed with predatory hunger, closing the gap with every moment. "Move faster! Keep them together!" barked a grizzled guard, his shield raised as he watched the rooftops. One of the creatures darted forward, its sharp jaws snapping as it lunged toward a young guard. He met it with his blade, the steel slicing through its flank, sending it skittering back with a shriek. Before he could recover, another stalker leapt from the side, its jaws clamping onto his arm with a sickening crunch. He cried out, blood pouring from the wound as he fell to his knees. "Hold the line! Protect the civilians!" The grizzled guard shouted, driving his spear into the side of the attacking beast. The tension mounted as more stalkers moved in, circling like wolves. On the rooftops, the shadows shifted as several climbed above the fleeing group, their claws scraping tiles, ready to pounce. A crack of thunder split the air, and in an instant, Ayanga streaked across the sky, her figure illuminated by arcs of crackling lightning. Her hood fell back, revealing glowing eyes that pulsed with light as she descended toward the pack of stalkers. She extended her hands, releasing bolts of electricity that struck the creatures with precision, leaving their charred bodies twitching on the cobblestones. "Stand fast! They cannot withstand us," she called, her voice cutting through the chaos. The stalkers turned their attention skyward, their predatory instincts locking onto her. One leapt from a rooftop, its powerful legs propelling it toward her with claws outstretched. Ayanga pivoted midair, sending a searing bolt of lightning directly into its chest. The beast crashed to the ground, lifeless. Among the frenzy, one stalker moved with calculated precision, stalking along the rooftops, its amber eyes locked onto Eden, who stood at the head of the evacuation effort, directing the guards and civilians with calm authority. The beast tensed, its muscles coiling as it launched itself toward her, its claws outstretched. The attack was sudden and savage, but before it could land, chains, faintly glowing with spectral light, shot from the shadows. They wrapped around the stalker's neck midair, yanking it backward with immense force. The beast let out a strangled cry as it was hurled into a pile of debris, the impact sending shards of wood and stone flying. From the darkness emerged Samuel Andrews, his expression cold and determined. His chain whip remained taut around the stalker's throat as he stepped closer. The beast thrashed violently, but Samuel's grip held firm. The glow of the chains intensified, and crude cursed talismans tied to their base began to shimmer with unstable energy. Samuel leapt onto the stalker's back, his boot pressing down hard on its neck. The talismans pulsed as he muttered a shaky incantation, his movements clumsy but focused. The stalker's snarls grew weaker, its glowing eyes dimming as the magic began to take hold. The thrashing slowed until it stopped altogether, the beast's body going limp under his control. Eden turned toward Samuel, her blindfold concealing the faint glow of her draconic eyes. "Samuel, thy timing is impeccable. My thanks." Her voice was calm, but there was a note of relief beneath her measured tone. Ayanga landed beside them, her movements graceful but sharp. Her hands still crackled faintly with residual lightning as she surveyed the subdued stalker. A fine display, Andrews. Thy skill hath saved lives this day. Samuel exhaled, his grip on the chains loosening as the talisman's glow faded. The stalker let out a low, guttural growl, but remained still, its will subdued. Samuel glanced at the creature, his expression unreadable. This one is mine now. The others will follow, or they will fall. Eden nodded, her tone resolute. We shall not linger. Guards, civilians, to the Golden Bough. Move swiftly. The guards rallied, pushing forward with renewed determination as they escorted the civilians down the narrow streets. Ayanga took to the air once more, her glowing eyes scanning for any remaining threats as the group pressed toward safety. Samuel lingered for a moment, his hand resting on the subdued stalker's neck. His expression darkened as he muttered under his breath, "This is but the beginning." With his chain whip coiled in his hand, he turned and followed the group, ready for whatever awaited them. The chamber was still, save for the faint rhythmic drip of water echoing against the cold stone walls. The light of the torches along the walls flickered weakly, their flames dimmed, as though suffocated by the oppressive darkness that hung in the air. At the center of the room lay the black reservoir, its surface unnaturally smooth and reflective, like a shard of obsidian carved from the void itself. Father Maxime Mori knelt at the edge of the reservoir, his pale form bathed in the eerie glow of faint runes carved into the stone around the water's edge. His face was calm, but his hollow eyes burned with quiet fervor, his lips murmuring a prayer in reverent tones. The words were indistinct, a whisper in a tongue not meant for mortal ears. From the edges of the room, shadows writhed, their shapes unnatural, stretching and coiling as though alive. They pulsed in time with Maxime's words, responding to his prayer with an unearthly rhythm, the room itself seeming to hold its breath. "Maiden of the Void, hear thy servant," Maxime whispered, his voice trembling with devotion. "Let me be thine instrument. In thy name I offer myself to the abyss. May thy will be done. May thy darkness reign eternal." The reservoir began to ripple. With deliberate movements, Maxime rose and stepped into the reservoir. The black water lapped at his ankles, unnaturally cold, the chill cutting through flesh and bone as though it sought his very soul. He did not falter. With each step, the water climbed higher, enveloping his legs, his waist, his chest. The shadows around the room grew more frantic, their pulsations quickening as they cast grotesque shapes across the stone walls. The faint runes lining the reservoir began to glow, their light the only defiance against the encroaching dark. Maxime paused as the water reached his throat, his head tilted back, his arms spread wide. He spoke once more, his voice echoing with unnatural clarity. From the dark was the first breath drawn. To the dark shall the last breath return. Guide me, maiden, that I may carry thy will into the lightless depths of this world. With that, Maxime let himself fall backward into the water, his pale form sinking beneath the black surface. The ripples stilled immediately, leaving the reservoir as smooth as glass. The torches in the room extinguished, plunging the chamber into absolute darkness. For a moment there was silence. Then came a low hum, rising steadily in pitch and intensity. The reservoir's edges began to glow faintly, a deep crimson light emanating from the runes carved into the stone. The water itself began to churn violently, casting thick, black waves against its confines. Suddenly, Maxime burst forth from the reservoir, his body arched backward, his arms stretched wide. The black water clung to his skin, dripping sluggishly as though reluctant to release him. His pale face was now streaked with inky black veins, pulsating faintly as they spread across his neck and shoulders. His hollow eyes shone with a faint red glow, their intensity matching the rune's light. The shadows around the room pulsed wildly, converging toward the reservoir's edge as though drawn to Maxime. They twisted and stretched, spiraling upward to surround him, wrapping his form in a shifting shroud of darkness. The air was heavy, crackling with an unseen force. Maxime's lips moved, but no sound emerged. Yet the room seemed to respond, the shadows vibrating as though in answer to his silent incantation. The crimson glow of the runes flared brighter, the reservoir itself trembling under the force of the unseen power. As Maxime stepped from the water, his movements were slow, deliberate. The black veins across his body throbbed faintly with each step, their presence a stark contrast against his pale, water-slicked skin. The shadows that clung to him began to retreat, fading back into the room's corners, leaving only a faint tremor in the air. The chamber was silent once more. Maxime stood at the edge of the reservoir, his head tilted slightly upward, his face serene yet otherworldly. A faint, cold smile played across his lips as his voice finally broke the silence. "The veil is thinned, O maiden. Thy path begins here, where shadow and flesh entwine. Come forth and claim thy dominion." The torches reignited of their own accord, casting their weak, flickering light over the chamber. The glow of the runes dimmed, and the reservoir's surface stilled once more, its black sheen reflecting Maxime's pale visage as he turned to leave. Behind him, the shadows pulsed once more, then were still. The moon hung low over the verdant easts, its pale light struggling to pierce through the decaying canopy. Willem Tot stood over a small makeshift stove, meticulously arranging ingredients scavenged from the forest. Despite the corruption choking the land, he had managed to forage just enough to prepare a meal. One that promised survival for the night and strength for the coming battle. Nazareth, towering and impassive, leaned against a tree nearby, absently twirling the dual-bladed artifact in his clawed hand. The faint carvings along its surface pulsed softly, but neither paid it much heed. His golden eyes narrowed as he watched Willem fumble with his equipment. "Thy hands are steady for ghosts, Toth, but clumsy for meat and flame. How is this meal to fuel victory if thou canst not even light thy stove properly?" Willem shot him a sharp glare. "If thou wishest to eat ash, then pray continue thy jeers. If not, silence would serve thee better. This is no common stew. This requires precision." Nazareth snorted, waving the artifact dismissively, its light briefly flaring. "Thy precision is as inspiring as thy supper. What of thy plan be thou hast so lauded? Or is it naught but air like the rest of thy craft?" Willem exhaled through his nose. kneading a lump of dough with frustration. Plan B relies upon the aura of death from the silent gates. This meal shall render us immune to it, while the Guardian will suffer greatly within its bounds. If thou prefereth not to partake, then I welcome thee to face death on an empty stomach. As Willem continued, a crucial step faltered. His sauce, meant to stabilize the delicate properties of the dish, began to separate, curdling into an unusable mess. He cursed under his breath, wiping his hands on his apron. Too much heat. Blasted campfire. I must start again. Nazareth opened his mouth to respond when the artifact in his hand flared violently, its carvings glowing with furious intensity. Both men froze, their gazes snapping to the forest around them as the sound of cracking branches and heavy, chittering breaths filled the air. Toth, Nazareth growled, his claws tightening on the artifact. Prepare thyself. We are not alone. From the treetops descended the corrupt Guardian, its massive, multi-limbed form a grotesque silhouette against the faint moonlight. Its elongated, bony limbs moved with unnerving speed, while a long, tendril-like tongue lashed out, slicing through the air with a sound like tearing cloth. Trees toppled as the creature descended, its amber eyes glowing with malice. Nazareth leapt forward, roaring, as he raised the artifact like a great hammer and slammed it toward the creature. The Guardian dodged with unnatural agility, its limbs bending and twisting as it vaulted off a nearby tree, its tongue darting toward Willem. Willem dove behind Nazareth, the ground erupting behind him as the tongue sliced through soil and stone. This was not part of the plan. Keep it distracted. I need to summon aid. Nazareth snarled, stepping into the fray. He weathered the blows, his scaled skin impervious to the creature's lashing tongue and slicing claws. With each strike, he counted, his blows shattering parts of the Guardian's bony exoskeleton. Yet the creature moved with acrobatic precision, dodging many of his attempts. Thy frailty doth offend me, Nazareth bellowed, grabbing the creature mid-leap. His claws dug into its head, and with a sickening crack, he ripped its jaw clean from its skull, the tendril-like tongue writhing as it fell to the ground. Nazareth roared triumphantly, holding the severed jaw aloft. So much for thy undying nature, wilder superstition. Behold, a corpse laid bare by my might. As Nazareth stepped back to admire his handiwork, Willem froze, his eyes darting to the artifact on Nazareth's belt, which now glowed violently. Around them, the spirits of fallen wilders began to materialize, their expressions twisted with unease. Nazareth, step back. Something is wrong, Willem warned, his voice trembling. The Guardian's broken body began to convulse. From within its shattered frame, new limbs sprouted, grotesque and wet. Its form swelled, shedding its brittle outer shell to reveal a far more repugnant, multi-tongued monstrosity. Each tongue lashed out in wild arcs, cutting through trees, and even severing the lingering wilder spirits, which it consumed in bursts of black energy. One of the tongues darted toward Willem, who barely dodged as a spirit ally shielded him, disintegrating in the process. Another spirit pushed him aside from a second strike, but with fewer spirits remaining, a tongue finally came within inches of its target. Only for an undead wilder to leap between Willem and the attack. The zombie's body was torn apart but held firm, joined by other undead wilders, who shielded Willem as the beast advanced. From the shadows stepped Maxim Mori, his pale face partially visible in the dim light. "Impressive, Cook. Thy command of the dead is crude but effective. Perhaps now thou couldst use mine." Maxim raised a skeletal hand, and his legion of undead wilders surged forward, swarming the Guardian. Though many fell to its lashing tongues, they slowed it enough for Nazareth to re-engage. "This thing cannot be slain. It defies all law," Nazareth growled, hammering the creature with blows that only seemed to slow it. "It is bound by law," Maxim countered coldly. "Thou simply hast not the means. Only the wilder tongue can seal it." "I know," Willem snapped, his eyes darting to the trees. "Shaman, thou watchest. I know it. Thy forest depends on thee. Help us!" For a long moment there was silence. Then, from the shadows of the trees, the wilder shaman's spirit emerged. Its spectral form, faint, but purposeful. It moved to Nazareth, retrieving the artifact from his belt with reverence before stepping toward the Guardian. The corrupt Guardian, its grotesque new form of writhing tongues and jagged limbs, loomed over the clearing. Its amber eyes burned with primal fury as it lashed its tongues against the ground, cutting deep trenches into the soil. Willem stood back, resolute. His eyes darted to the remaining wilder spirits lingering around him, their translucent forms flickering faintly. He raised his voice, addressing the spirits directly. "Thou must aid me. Translate my words to the beast. If it cannot understand, then it cannot listen." The spirits hesitated, their hollow eyes flickering with uncertainty. Then one stepped forward, its voice like rustling leaves. "We shall speak thy words, spirit guide. But know this, the Guardian heareth only its law, and its rage is vast. Thy bargain must carry weight." Willem nodded sharply, swallowing his hesitation. "Tell it this. The time for wrath hath passed. We come not to destroy, but to restore balance. This forest rejecteth thee not for what thou art, but for what thou hast become." The spirits turned to the Guardian, their whispers forming guttural, inhuman sounds as they relayed Willem's plea. The Guardian hissed, its tongue snapping wildly, tearing through the air. The response was swift, snarling, and filled with malice. "It saith balance is a lie," the spirit translated. "It saith it hath no equal. Its corruption is strength, its fury righteous. It boweth to no mortal tongue." Willem clenched his fists. "Then offer it this, a battle, not of slaughter, but of station. If it hath strength, let it prove so against the shaman who sealed it. A duel to decide who shall guard this forest." The spirits spoke again, their whispers rising in intensity. The Guardian stilled, its head tilting sharply, its jagged limbs tense. It snarled low, its response heavy with disdain. "It saith thy words amuse it, rogue. It accepteth the challenge. But know this, the shaman shall fail, as all others have before." The air grew heavier as the shaman spirit stepped forward, its spectral form solidifying slightly, the artifact in its hands glowing brighter. The Guardian roared, lowering its body into a predatory stance before lunging forward, its tongues lashing out in a chaotic frenzy. The shaman moved with ethereal grace, evading the strikes as it closed the gap. The artifact slashed through the air, severing one tongue. Then another. Each strike sent bursts of light through the clearing, forcing the Guardian to recoil. The creature leapt into the trees, its limbs cutting through branches as it ascended. From above, it lashed out with its remaining tongues, uprooting trees and sending debris raining down. The shaman leapt into the air, meeting the Guardian mid-flight in a clash of raw power. The artifact glowed brilliantly as it struck the Guardian's core, releasing a shockwave that rattled the clearing. Willem watched from below, his voice trembling as he translated the shaman's words for Nazareth and Maxim. It saith the Guardian was never meant to dwell here. Its corruption is the plane's rejection of its presence. This world's balance rejecteth what is forced upon it. Nazareth, his golden eyes fixed on the battle, grunted. So the wilder meddling caused this beast's ruin. Fitting that their dead must clean their folly. The Guardian screeched, its limbs flailing as it used the environment to gain an advantage. It moved with blinding speed, its tongues slicing through even the faint spirits that lingered near the battle. The shaman, though relentless, began to show strain, its spectral form flickering as it endured blow after blow. At last, the Guardian lunged, all its tongues converging on the shaman in a final assault. But the shaman raised the artifact high, its light blinding as it struck down, severing the Guardian's largest limb. The creature shrieked as the artifact drove into its core, splitting its body apart with a resounding burst of energy. The creature let out an ear-splitting screech as its body convulsed violently, the miasma dissipating in a burst of energy. Its limbs collapsed, and its massive frame crumbled into ash. The shaman stood victorious, its form flickering faintly in the aftermath. The shaman turned to Willem, its hollow eyes burning with faint light. The spirits around Willem began to whisper, their voices translating the shaman's words. The Guardian is no more, but its death shall not be permanent. This plane rejecteth what is forced upon it. Only one born of the forest may truly guard its roots. I shall take its place, for none else can. Willem nodded, his voice quiet but firm. Thou hast my respect, shaman. Thy sacrifice is beyond measure. The verdant Easts owe thee their salvation. The shaman raised a hand, the artifact glowing brightly one final time before embedding itself into the ground. The spirits surrounding Willem murmured softly, their forms fading one by one until only the shaman remained. It inclined its head toward Willem before vanishing into the mist, leaving the forest eerily silent. Nazareth broke the quiet, his voice sharp. So, the wilder fables were not folly after all. A shame this truth required so much blood. Maxim stepped forward, his tone measured. The Guardian's corruption is not the end of this tale. Thy settlement must know what transpired here. They must tread carefully lest this cycle repeats. Willem exhaled heavily, nodding. Aye, but what cometh next is equally pressing. This is but one battle. More will follow, if we cannot secure true balance. Maxim's faint smirk betrayed a flicker of amusement. Spoken like one who understandeth the weight of his role, thy instincts are sharp, Toth. Let us hope they guide thee as well in days to come. Willem, his voice weary but firm, replied, Nor was thine, Maxim. Thy timing hath proven crucial, but let us not linger. There is much to report. Nazareth, wiping ichor from his claws, smirked. Aye, let us return. But not without note of my handiwork. The forest shall remember who bested the beast, even if its spawn would claim the victory. Maxime chuckled faintly. Ere long, the tower shall hear of thy exploits, Nazareth. Thy humility is boundless. Maxime turns back to Willem, truly fascinated. Thou hast shown skill beyond what I expected. Thy command over the dead is precise, and thy courage commendable. Thy presence here was no accident. Nazareth, his patience clearly waning. Enough of thy riddles, Maury. Thou hast shadowed us long enough. If thou meanest to help, then do so. Elsewise, out of our path. Maxim inclined his head, his expression unreadable. As thou wishest. The road ahead is long, but shadows shorten it. Come, let us return to thy settlement. My portal shall carry us. He extended a pale hand, the shadows around him gathering and swirling into a darkened archway. Willem hesitated for a moment, his exhaustion dulling his intuition before stepping forward. Nazareth strode through confidently, and Maxime followed, his presence lingering in the clearing as the shadow portal swallowed them whole. The Golden Bough was alive with muted activity, the air filled with the warmth of simmering food and the low murmur of conversation. Civilians sat together, sharing meals served by Eden and her helpers. The recent strides in resource management, devised by Eden and Zinhera, ensured that no one went hungry despite the settlement's dwindling supplies. Eden moved among the tables, her voice calm and measured as she spoke words of reassurance to the weary denizens. Her white dress and purple cloak swayed as she placed portions in front of each group, her blindfold concealing her glowing eyes, but not the quiet strength in her demeanor. Beside her, Zinhera assisted, her precise movements and keen knowledge of rations ensuring nothing was wasted. In a quieter corner, Samuel Andrews approached Eden and Zinhera, his brow furrowed, his chains coiled loosely around his wrists. He lowered his voice, careful not to alarm the civilians. I must speak with thee both. I hath seen something troubling in the streets. Eden paused, her attention sharpening. Speak plainly, Samuel. What trouble hath arisen now? Samuel glanced around, his tone low. Undead. A band of them, moving through the shadows. They devour the Wilders and their stalkers, but leave the rogues and civilians untouched. 'Tis a strange thing. Their hunger seems selective. Zinhera frowned, her voice carrying a note of concern. Selective. Such creatures care not for distinction. If they are driven by hunger, why spare any? Eden's hand rested lightly on the table beside her, her voice thoughtful. This could mean more than we yet understand. Didst thou see whence they came? Were they guided, perhaps? Samuel shook his head. No sign of a master, though their movements were too purposeful to be feral. They feasted upon the remnants of a wilder, and one of their stalkers. 'Twas unnatural. Before further discussion could unfold, the room's flickering lantern light dimmed briefly, and from the corner, shadows swirled into a jagged, gaping void. Nazareth stepped through, his imposing form cutting a stark silhouette, as the portal snapped shut behind him with a sharp hiss. He looked around, his golden eyes narrowing when he saw no sign of Willem. The Golden Bough grew quiet for a moment, all eyes turning to the unexpected visitor. Nazareth, brushing a stray bit of dust from his shoulder, strode toward the others without hesitation. "Thy beast is dead," he announced bluntly. Its many tongues silenced, its monstrous bones scattered. Yet as I return, I see not celebration nor gratitude. Thou art as warm as a corpse. Eden stepped forward, her voice measured. "Thy success is most welcome, Nazareth. The settlement owes thee much. But where is Willem? Was he not with thee?" Nazareth shrugged, his expression unreadable. "The cook? Mayhap he lingereth, lost in his own steps. He enjoyeth the long road, or so I have heard. Perchance he hath decided to walk." His smirk was sharp, cutting. "Or thou mayest check thy kitchen where he belongeth." The subtle insult drew faint frowns. Samuel, however, watched Nazareth intently, his expression unreadable. "Nazareth," Eden began, "we entrusted thee and Willem with a dire task. If he hath not returned, we must know why. Dost thou truly know naught of his fate?" Nazareth spread his hands lazily. "What I know is this. The Guardian is felled. Thy promises, however, remain unfulfilled. But fret not. I came not to waste time with thy games. Samuel, we must speak now." Nazareth led Samuel to a quieter corner, away from prying ears. Once they stopped, he folded his arms, his tone direct. "Speak, Samuel. The house of tiny lies. What dost thou know? Thou hast thy bargain to keep." Samuel nodded, lowering his voice. "The information comes from the guards who once served them. Their words are true, Nazareth, as they hath nothing left to gain from their former masters." He gestured faintly as he spoke. "The house hath grown weak. Its leadership is hidden within the eastern quarter, but their presence is thin. 2 guards remain, both loyal but ill-trained and poorly equipped. Thy entrance shall not be difficult." Nazareth's eyes narrowed slightly. "The guild master. Where doth he dwell?" Samuel continued without hesitation. "The guards spoke of the uppermost floor, private, guarded more by secrecy than strength. The floor plan is simple, narrow halls, a single stairwell to his quarters. Thou canst reach him swiftly, if thou moveth with purpose." Nazareth tilted his head, his golden eyes gleaming. 2 guards, many masters, a narrow path. Thy word is clear, Samuel. Thou hast earned my respect. I shall remember this. Samuel inclined his head. "See that thou dost, Nazareth. This settlement requires more than strength. It requireth trust. Do not squander it." Nazareth chuckled faintly, though his tone remained sharp. "Trust is earned, not given. Thou art one of the few who understandeth this. Pray thou keep thy wisdom." The unease in the room deepened as the group exchanged glances. The room remained silent as he exited, leaving the others to ponder his cryptic words. Willem took but 2 steps into the void, the shadowy threshold promising a safe return to the settlement. Yet in the instant he realized, no familiar light or sanctuary lay beyond. His footing vanished. He was displaced, abruptly and utterly, plunged into a realm of suffocating black water. The icy chill struck him first, sinking deep into his bones, followed by the crushing realization of being far below the surface. Willem flailed instinctively, his limbs thrashing against the oppressive cold. The water carried a weight beyond its physical substance, a creeping presence that seemed to press upon his soul. It was dark, nearly impenetrable, save for a faint red light far above, a glimmer of some unknown surface, and two dim figures descending slowly toward him. Shadows writhed around the figures as their shapes took form, pallid, skeletal visages marked by hollow eyes and twisted grins, their arms outstretched as though to receive him. Willem's breath caught, but resolve hardened within him. His survival instincts surged as he pushed the cold's influence away from his heart and gathered himself to swim upward, defying the icy grip that sought to root him in place. The ascent was grueling, his limbs heavy and unresponsive under the water's weight. The figures moved faster now, their movements unnatural, their grotesque faces illuminated faintly by the distant red glow. They reached for him, their fingers like talons. Willem kicked desperately, his body screaming for air, but their hands seized him, dragging him back down into the abyss. He struggled violently, the frigid water leaching his strength, exhaustion threatening to consume him. Their faces loomed closer, hollow sockets unblinking as they pulled him deeper. Willem's lungs burned as the cold crept closer. No longer an external force, but an invasive chill, gnawing at his resolve. It whispered to him in sensations he could not comprehend, but instinctively rejected. Still, he fought, his vision narrowing, his strength failing. Just as he was about to succumb, his body sinking limp, his will faltering, the cold shifted. It no longer smothered him, but welcomed him. He felt its stillness seep into his being, a numbness that dulled the panic. Everything went black. Suddenly, as if waking from a nightmare, Willem burst from the surface, gasping and sputtering, the icy reservoir clinging to his skin. Black water cascaded from his form, soaking him utterly as he heaved for air. The crimson light above flickered faintly, and the silence of the void was broken only by his ragged breaths. His limbs trembled, his mind reeling as the oppressive stillness lingered in his veins, a cold presence that felt foreign, yet now inseparable. Willem floated for a moment, suspended in the water's strange embrace. His senses overwhelmed by the quiet dread of where he had emerged and what awaited him beyond. The night clung to the settlement, shadows deepening as Nazareth approached the House of Tiny Lies. The opulent guild hall loomed within its walled sanctuary, a glaring symbol of greed and decadence amidst the tower's decay. The gates, wrought iron and gold, stood unguarded, their intricate engravings tarnished by neglect. Nazareth strode forward, his golden eyes gleaming like smoldering embers. The weight of the intel Samuel had provided sharpened his steps, his mind fixed upon what lay ahead. 2 guards, a narrow path, a hall of riches ripe for the taking. The gates swung open with an eerie creak as he shoved them apart, the silence of the courtyard broken only by his deliberate footsteps. At the guild hall's grand doors, the guards awaited. As promised, they were both wounded. Bandages soaked through, movements sluggish. Yet, as Nazareth closed the distance, their swords flashed to life in defiance. Both struck at once, their blades cutting arcs through the dim air. Nazareth moved with precision, sidestepping the first swing and catching the second guard's blade in his bare hand. With a twist and a brutal kick, he drove one guard into the heavy oak door, the crack of his skull echoing as the man crumpled lifelessly to the ground. The second hesitated, trembling with his sword raised. "Mercy," he rasped, his voice shaking. Nazareth's lips curved into a cold smile. "Mercy? How droll. I deal not in alms, worm. I deal in ends." In a single motion, Nazareth drove his knee into the man's chest, lifting him off his feet before slamming him against the wall. Blood sprayed as the man's body slumped, smearing a crimson streak down the polished stone. Nazareth wiped a speck of blood from his hand, his expression unflinching as he pushed the doors open. The guild hall stretched before him in decadent silence, corridors lined with gilded trim and tapestries depicting the guild's triumphs. Room after room passed, their contents unimportant to his mission. He moved with purpose, his senses fixed on the prize ahead. At last he entered a cavernous library, and his steps faltered. The walls were lined with towering shelves, each overflowing with neatly bound contracts. Parchments of opportunity, promises of gold, and leverage over the tower's desperate souls filled the room. The air reeked of ink and old paper. Nazareth's grin widened as he surveyed the hoard. "So, these are thy precious shackles," he muttered, his voice cold and sharp. "Chains for the desperate, treasures for the craven. All this power, and soon it shall be mine." He strode through the room, brushing his hand against the scrolls, envisioning the wealth and influence these contracts would afford him once the guildmasters were dealt with. These were not just jobs. They were the lifeblood of the tower's economy, hoarded and wielded with surgical cruelty. Leaving the library behind, Nazareth approached the hallway leading to the guildmaster's office. The faint hum of voices drifted through the ornate door, their conversation muffled but heated. He placed his hand on the brass handle, his golden eyes narrowing. With a shove, the doors crashed open. Inside, the room was illuminated by a roaring hearth, the flicker of flames casting shadows over its occupants. The disagreeable master stood at the head of the table, his thin, calculating face contorted in frustration. Arrayed around him were several other guildmasters, but they were not alone. 6 figures, rogues by their posture and presence, stood calmly, each one exuding a quiet, deadly confidence. Their diverse forms were shadowed, their faces unreadable, but their aura was unmistakable. They were seasoned killers, and the room belonged to them. The disagreeable master turned, his eyes widening in recognition, as Nazareth stepped inside. A moment of silence passed, the tension coiled like a serpent. Then, the disagreeable master's voice rang out. "A bounty!" he roared, his voice shrill with panic. "I offer a king's ransom to any who slay this wretch!" The rogues moved before the words fully left his lips. They descended upon Nazareth with eerie precision, their actions silent and deliberate. A crack of energy surged, the air itself seeming to twist. In the span of a breath, Nazareth raised his scaled arms in defense, his golden hide shimmering with resilience. The first blow landed, and the room shifted into chaos. A soundless ripple surged outward, and the light from the hearth dimmed. Blades flashed, magic flared, shadows writhed like living things. In an instant, Nazareth's cry of pain echoed through the chamber, sharp and guttural. The rogues struck in perfect unison, their forms shifting like ghosts, their weapons bypassing his defenses as though they had pierced the very fabric of reality. His scales cracked, his golden eyes wide with disbelief. Magic crackled across his chest. Shadow tendrils wrapped around his legs. He lashed out, a monstrous roar shaking the chamber, but it was too late. The last thing Nazareth saw was the glint of a dagger aimed for his throat, its edge glowing faintly. And then, darkness. Suddenly, the chaos was gone. Nazareth stood in the quiet hallway, his hand still resting on the door handle. His breath was steady, his body unscathed, but his golden eyes burned with the knowledge of what he had seen. A premonition, his fate, bending gift, had warned him of the disastrous path ahead. He lingered, his hand tightening on the handle. Behind the door, the muffled voices continued, oblivious to the predator in their midst. Nazareth's jaw clenched as the weight of his decision settled over him. Would he heed the vision, or defy it, plunging headlong into the jaws of death?